In the fading light of a 1950s autumn, every kitchen in Britain was working against the same deadline. Winter was coming, and what wasn't preserved by November simply wouldn't exist by February. By the end of this video, you'll have the actual methods, 20 of them, that British families used to make a single pig, a garden full of vegetables, and a hedge of damsons last an entire winter. Methods that have all but vanished from British kitchens in the space of one generation. After collecting accounts of salting troughs, potting jars, and root clamps from families across Yorkshire, Lancashire, East Anglia, and Cumbria, what emerges isn't a list of recipes. It's a system, one where nothing was thrown away because nothing could afford to be. Every week, fewer people remain who learned these methods first-hand from a parent or grandparent standing beside them in the kitchen. This video is an attempt to write some of that down before it's gone. You've probably been told that British food before the freezer was bland and basic. The people who say that have never tasted bacon that spent 3 weeks being hand-basted in salt, or a pickled walnut that had a year to mature on a dark shelf. It started in the back garden, with the pig that had lived there since spring. In the week before Christmas, it was killed. And for the next 3 weeks, the kitchen table disappeared under salt. A woman in a Sheffield terrace would rub 3 parts salt to 2 of brown sugar into every flitch of bacon by hand, working it into the fat until her fingers stung. The meat went skin down into a shallow wooden trough lined with lead, a salting lead kept under the stairs. And every single day for 3 weeks she came back to baste the meat in its own salty liquor. Therefore, the bacon that hung from the kitchen beam by January carried a flavour no fridge-cured rasher has ever matched, because no fridge-cured rasher spends 3 weeks being basted by hand. For larger joints, some families went further still, moving the meat from its dry rub into a barrel of brine, close to 2 pounds of salt, to the gallon, turned and checked for weeks on end. Down the coast, herring families had their own version, and it happened in hours rather than weeks. The fish were split, gutted, and dropped into vats of brine, so strong a hand left in too long would start to ache. 10 to 30 minutes was enough before they went onto the smoking racks. That short, brutal soak was what turned an ordinary herring into a kipper that would keep through the darkest months. But salting was only the first stage for some of what came off that pig. Leftover stewing meat, boiled until it fell apart, was pounded by hand with salt, pepper, and butter into a paste, then pressed firmly into small jars, pressed hard to push out every pocket of air, and finished with a seal of clarified butter poured on top while still hot. On the Lancashire coast, fishermen's wives did the same with something far smaller. Brown shrimps from Morecambe Bay were boiled in seawater, picked by hand, and packed tight into earthenware pots. Clarified butter, melted slowly, skimmed. The milky solids left behind was poured over them, spiced with mace and nutmeg until it reached every wall of the pot. Therefore, once that butter set solid in a cold pantry, the shrimps underneath were sealed away from air completely, and a pot of potted shrimps could sit on a shelf for weeks and still be opened on a Sunday tasting exactly as it had the day it was made. What turned this from a fisherman's wife's necessity into a national dish wasn't the recipe. It was the railway, which by the 19th century could carry small pots of Morecambe Bay shrimps to London in hours, putting a kitchen preserve onto tables the shrimps themselves had never seen. Out in the garden, September told a different story. The allotment was emptier than it had been all summer, but the kitchen was fuller than at any other point in the year, because everything that hadn't been eaten had to become something that would keep. Cauliflower, onion, beans, and small cucumbers were chopped, salted, and left overnight until they'd given up their water. Then simmered in vinegar with mustard, turmeric, and sugar, thickened until it turned that unmistakable mustard yellow that sat on every Boxing Day table for 30 years. Up in the branches, walnuts picked green in late June went through something stranger. Pricked all over with a fork, left in strong brine for a week or two, then dried in the air for days until they turned black before being packed into jars and covered with hot vinegar carrying allspice, cloves, and fresh ginger. A pickled walnut was one of the few things in a British larder that improved with a year of waiting. The green tomatoes that never turned red went the same way, chopped with onion and apple, salted overnight, then simmered slowly in vinegar and sugar with ginger and raisins until the pan reduced to a thick, dark chutney that turned plain bread and cheese into a meal, and the eggs, hard-boiled, peeled, packed warm into jars, and covered with hot spiced vinegar, left to mature on a cool shelf for weeks. A pickled egg wasn't a snack. It was protein that didn't need a fridge sitting in the pantry for whenever it was needed. None of this happened because anyone particularly enjoyed pickling. It happened because the Dig for Victory campaign had told an entire country to grow more than it could eat fresh, and an entire country needed somewhere to put the surplus. That rhythm didn't stop when the war did. It carried on through the 50s and into the 60s, in exactly the same kitchens, with exactly the same jars. But pickling could only deal with vegetables. Fruit needed a different answer, and in a stone-floored larder in Cumbria, that answer filled the shelves every September. Kilner jars, washed and sterilized in a hot oven, were packed with plums and damsons from the hedgerows, covered with a light sugar syrup, sealed loosely with their rubber rings and clips, then sat on a rack in a deep pan, covered with water 2 inches above the lids, and simmered gently for 20 to 40 minutes. As the jars cooled, left completely still for a full day, the air inside contracted and pulled the lids down so tight that a jar of plums sealed in September would still be sound the following summer. The damsons that didn't go into jars were boiled down, sieved smooth, and weighed, and an equal weight of sugar went back into the pan with them, cooked on the lowest possible heat, stirred constantly until a spoonful held its shape on a cold plate, then spread into trays and dried for hours until it could be cut into firm, dark blocks of damson cheese, sliced thin and eaten with cold meat at Christmas by families who no longer remember why it started. Quinces went through the same process, cooked down to a deep red paste, dense enough to cut with a knife, and the apples too plentiful to bottle became apple butter, simmered for an hour or two with cinnamon and cloves until they darkened to a deep amber brown. Every jar that came out of that September session got a label, pencil or grease pen, contents and month, not because anyone needed reminding what damson cheese looked like, but because the shelf held 2 years of jars at once, and last September's had to be eaten first. But all of this depended on a room most houses don't have anymore, a larder, cold, dark, often facing north, with stone shelves built for exactly this. When that room became a cupboard with a boiler in it, the jars had nowhere left to wait. There's one more set of methods, though, the ones that needed no jars, no vinegar, and almost nothing at all. By October, a rural farmhouse kitchen smelled of 3 things at once: smoke, dried apples, and damp earth, because all 3 jobs happened in the same few weeks. The apples too small for bottling were cored, sliced thin, dipped briefly in water with lemon to stop them browning, then laid out, never touching, on racks near the range, or strung on threads where the fire's heat could reach them without cooking them. A day or two later, they'd gone from pale and wet to leathery and dry, packed into tins for the winter, ready to be soaked back to softness for a pie whenever one was wanted. Herbs went up the same way, small bunches tied at the stem, hung upside down near the chimney breast, dried hard within a fortnight, and crumbled into jars. Flavour locked in for stews not yet cooked, but the smell that dominated everything was smoke. The bacon and fish that had already been through the salt needed one more stage, hung in the chimney itself, or in a small shed built for nothing else, above a fire of hardwood kept deliberately smouldering. For days, the smoke crept around the meat, drying it further, and coating it in flavour no oven could replicate. A bacon side that had been salted for 3 weeks and then smoked for several days was a different food entirely. Denser, darker, able to hang from a beam for months. And then came the part that happened outside with a spade. The potatoes, carrots, beetroot and turnips that had filled the allotment all summer were stacked into a pyramid on a bed of sand and straw, biggest at the bottom, then buried under more straw, and a final layer of soil, with one tuft of straw left poking out at the top like a chimney to let the heat and damp escape. What looked, from a distance, like nothing more than a mound of earth in the corner of a garden was actually a working larder a family could dig into in January and pull out vegetables as fresh as the day they were buried. Where there was a shed or cellar instead, the same vegetables went into wooden boxes, layered with damp sand, never touching, never drying out, never rotting, but all of it, the smoke, the drying racks, the mound in the garden, depended on something that disappeared faster than any of the techniques themselves. The assumption that winter was something you prepared for, not something a shop solved for you. That's the thread running through all 20 of these methods: salting, potting, pickling, bottling, drying, smoking, clamping. None of them were unusual. They were simply what a British autumn was for. There's one thing, though, that came up again and again when people were asked what they missed most. And it isn't a recipe at all. It's the sound of jars being checked on a Sunday morning, one by one, to see which were ready to open that week. A small, quiet ritual that vanished the moment the freezer arrived, and that nobody thought to write down, because nobody thought it would ever stop. If your family kept any of these going past the 1970s, the smoking shed, the clamp in the garden, the jars on the larder shelf, tell us in the comments. We're collecting these stories before they're gone for good.